My name is Catherine Arndt and I'm the Chief of the VLGA Connect Studio. I hope you enjoy today's Connect episode brought to you by the VLGA, the national broadcaster on all things local government.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the first Global Executive Panel for 2022, brought to you by the Victorian Local Governance Association and LGIU, the Local Government Information Unit. It's wonderful to see so many of you joining us, and we've got quite a few to come as well. As always, the program is recorded and made available to members after the fact for those who haven't been able to join us at this particular time. Before we get started, I would like to, on behalf of the VLGA, acknowledge the traditional owners of country throughout Victoria and recognise their continuing connection to land, waters and community. We pay our respects to the traditional owners, their elders, past, present and future, and to their cultures. Wherever you're joining us from this evening, whether it's in Victoria, elsewhere in Australia or overseas, we're very pleased to have you with us. I'll introduce your panelists very shortly and we'll get into the discussion, but firstly I'd like to call on Catherine Arndt, the CEO of the VLGA, to say a few words of welcome. Hi Catherine.
Hi Chris, and thank you for that introduction and welcome everyone. I'd like to acknowledge all of the councillors in the room who are joining us tonight, and also I'd like to acknowledge that we have in our audience tonight the Victorian Shadow Minister for Local Government, Richard Reardon. So it's terrific to see the participation tonight to talk about a very timely and relevant topic, which is local government reform, to get not only a local and national perspective, but also some global perspectives. And I'm very pleased that we've got a stellar panel of speakers lined up to talk to you this evening. Before I hand back to Chris, I would like to introduce our partners, LGIU, and we do have Hannah Muirhead and also Andy Johnson here with us today. But Hannah, I believe you'd like to say a few words on behalf of LGIU.
Yes, thank you, Catherine. Just a really quick intro for those that maybe aren't familiar with LGIU. Welcome, everybody. We're a membership organisation and think tank, and we've been operating in Australia for just over 2 years now, and many more years before that in the UK and Ireland. These executive panels are just a small part of our member offer, and we're really glad to be doing them with VLGA over the last year, and we've generated some really good discussions on a lot of different issues, and I hope this one will be no different. We've got 4 more panels scheduled in for the rest of 2022, and you can check our website for more details on those. And if your council's not a member of LGIU yet, if you get in touch with me, I can arrange for a free trial so you can get a feel for it all about. But yeah, enjoy the panel.
Thank you very much, Hannah, and thank you, Catherine. Let's begin with our session this evening. Our topic is local government sector reform, lessons and insights. And I'd like to very briefly welcome and have them just say a word of hello, our panellists this evening. Firstly, Dr. Pat Daly is joining us from Limerick City and County Council in Ireland. Pat is the CEO there, and I believe it's about 7:30 in the morning. Good morning to you, Pat.
Good morning, everybody. Hello, Australia, and hello from a lovely, hope to be sunny Limerick very soon.
Excellent. I'll come right back to you, Pat. Next up, we will have Steve Ruru, who's the CEO at Taranaki Regional Council in New Zealand, which is beyond us time-wise, about 8:35 in the evening. Steve, hello.
Kia ora, Chris, and great to be here and look forward to contributing tonight.
Fabulous. Back to the UK, and just north of London, I believe, is the CEO of Buckinghamshire Council, Rachel Shimon. Good morning to you, Rachel.
Well, good morning from England and good evening to all of you. Lovely to join you today.
Fabulous. And look, the technology is all working terrifically well. And this next one's not that far from me in terms of physical distance. Marcus Spiller is a principal and partner with SGS Economics and Planning. Marcus, good evening.
Good evening and good morning all.
Terrific. Thank you. I thought I'd jinxed myself with the comment about the technology. All right, sector reform. It's something that seems to be with us in some shape or form at any given point in time, it would seem. And we're going to learn tonight that that's the case pretty much globally. We're going to find out about Three Waters reform, which has been going on and is going on as we speak in New Zealand, major amalgamations of councils that are happening in the UK, and Rachel will give us some experience on that. And we're also going to look at what possible future reforms might there be. Theoretically, what could be done to help local government be more effective and deliver on its promise. But first, a major change in governance model is being carried out in Limerick in Ireland. Dr. Pat Daly is with us this evening, as we mentioned, to talk about this move to a directly elected mayoral model of governance following a plebiscite about 3 years ago. Now, Pat has some slides to work through and to set the scene. Pat, over to you, and welcome again.
Thanks again, Chris. Yeah, and again, good evening, good morning, everyone. Maybe I'll just start a little, Chris, and everybody, with a bit of a scene setter first. So just introduce Limerick to people. And you can see there's a few maps on your screen. Obviously Limerick, most westerly kind of our island in Europe. You can see us there in the red, shared with Northern Ireland and again our close neighbour England and the UK. So for Limerick, we are the capital of the Midwest of Ireland. So if you look at the kind of the map, the grey map with the circle, we're really the middle of the kind of west coast and what they kind of now call the Wild Atlantic Way, because we're on the Atlantic. The region has around 500,000 people and growing, and that consists of 3 county areas: Clare, Tipperary and Limerick. And you probably know those names from either songs or poems and things like that. So both Limerick City is the capital, about 200,000 people and growing in the metro and county area. And we're probably one of the fastest growing investment locations in Ireland outside of the capital. We have a very strong investment development program. And as a council ourselves, we amalgamated. We were 2 separate councils. We were a city council and we were a county council and the neighbouring Cheek and Jowl. But we amalgamated in 2014. That can be kind of a tough time for everybody. You know, you've double services, you're trying to bring them into one. So there was a lot of organization, design and development. So in fact, it wasn't really a merger, it was a new organization created. Around that, we were kind of developing a lot of new approaches in industry and services, and our budget kind of grew very strongly because we do a lot of national shared service, particularly in housing assistance, payments and management of that. So our budget is about 1.4 billion. It's the second largest financial budget in the country because of the various special purpose projects we do, the shared service nature of our business, and we run a lot of regional services. So growing in staff, about 1,500 staff at the moment, and a few more to come on board. But again, that's kind of static enough in the sense that there's a bit of natural attrition and people retiring and joining us all the time, which is a bit of a problem because you've got some very new people who don't have a history or a tradition of public service, probably coming with mixed backgrounds and from the private sector, and how they deal with councillors has to be constantly monitored, as we all know. We're acknowledged as a very strong leading local authority, and have done some interesting things. We've set up the first public interest development company as part of the council architecture back around 2014-15 to really guarantee delivery of key sites, and particularly economic sites. And that's been very successful. In fact, we ended up buying a former Dell manufacturing site and turned it into a film studio, which has been very successful. So really kind of change how Limerick does its business, the type of sectors it's working to, and future-proofing. And I think that led a lot of these approaches, and we were very lucky in job creation. And then when you have jobs, people want to follow the jobs and they come and visit. So they want housing, they want placemaking. And we were successful. So I think that unleashed a kind of a wave of ambition in people. Government has always had this ambition to have directly elected mayors, very common in Europe. But yet Ireland hasn't moved that way. So they offered a plebiscite to 3 locations that had amalgamated, which was Waterford, Tipperary, Waterford, Cork, and Limerick, as an open vote 3 years ago. I'd say the intention, the view in government was Cork as the second city might have taken it to have a go at kind of the capital. In fact, they didn't. Both fell. Waterford and Cork fell in the vote. Limerick came through in a 48-52 passing rate. And I think since that time, the bill has been designed to help it. So really people kind of wanted more. I think the government are very happy it is Limerick because we're big enough to be big and we're small enough to be small. So this is radical. This is the first time in 100 years that the model of government locally will change from the council manager type model to the directly elected mayor. The current model, and there is a lovely shot of our chamber, a big circular chamber that we can all eyeball one another in the row. But it is a very good council, I have to say, having amalgamated, and you have a very rural view and you have a very urban view. They've come together very well in the amalgamation. But the model is the mayor is elected each year from the body, from the assembly. That's normally agreed at the start of the council cycle, which is a 5-year cycle. And we're having local elections again now in 2024. So they kicked off around the 2019. And the plebiscite was actually held as part of local elections and as part of European elections and a referendum as well. So a lot of people said really wasn't sure what we were voting for because it came in a wave of votes. And now they're thinking deeply about it. But the issue kind of is, the mayor is agreed between the key parties that form the kind of the majority in council, and it goes in our case we have Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael, so 1 year Fianna Fáil, 1 year Fine Gael, and they have very much ceremonial powers. They lead and chair the council. The council sets heavy high-level policy and authority under what they have, what we call reserved powers here, and that's guided in the standing orders and the books. The chief executive has executive power then to carry out functions, so really operating like a full chief executive, but hand in glove with the council, as we all do, I imagine, and we work forward on a kind of a corporate plan basis and a development plan. What's going to come, and the bill is going through the Dáil at the moment, which is our parliament, and it is being shaped. It hasn't been formally voted on, but it is seeking then to bring forward a directly elected mayor. And if the bill passes, say, this year, I would imagine early next year, there would be a public vote in Limerick for a directly elected mayor who would now, if de facto, become the chief executive and would have full executive powers. The role of the chief executive will change to being a director general. This is shaped very much on a government model where you have the kind of minister responsible for the kind of the ministry, and you have the secretary general, as we call them, and their various assistant secretaries working the department. So minister is the boss and the sec gen is the operator. A very similar model to here. So the mayor becomes the boss, and then the former chief executive, now the director general, becomes like the chief operating officer, with what is going to be a new branch of powers called specified powers. So effectively, everything to do with operating the organization, the accounting officer, and individual decision making. So planning permissions, hiring, firing of staff, managing the budget with the mayor. All that will be done by the director general under the mayor's program. And once the mayor is elected, the mayor has to bring forward a mayoral program to council, and the council have to vote it through. So what we're really going to be entering is a coalition model of local administration. The mayor comes, we've obviously very well good plans in place. So you have the mayor, director general, and you'll have a new head of the council, so that the mayor will not chair the council meeting or manage that. That'll be done by a new post called the chair of the council. And that three-way model will hopefully then, once it settles in, become the new way of working. But the mayor will be the boss effectively, and that's radical for Ireland. It is definitely radical for Limerick, and we're shaping around that.
I don't think you needed to put anything on that's radical, because I think everyone in the audience is probably suggesting the same, although I'm sure this has been done elsewhere. Why is this change happening? What's been the rationale that's led to such a decision?
I think government have an ambition to really democratise policy and politics in Ireland. It's very central, managed by government and kind of top down. Limerick or Ireland is a relatively small country, about 5 million people in Ireland. We've 31 local authorities. So I think they're out of step with Europe in this. Yeah. So they have to start bringing forward proposals. And I think they want to see, how does it work then? How does it happen? And the UK have great examples. So we've been working and looking very closely at models in the UK because they have a longer experience of this. And in the next couple of weeks, we have the Mayor of London and the Mayor of Manchester coming to Ireland and talking to us around, look, this is how they see it operating. And really, it's the power of the people. So I think there's I think there was an energy in Limerick. I think there was a clamour to do this. There was obviously discussions with government and with local politicians, and there was a movement for it. And I'd say people really felt maybe Cork might have gone it, but Limerick took it. And what they're hoping then is that you get a dividend from this. So we would be hoping for a kind of a Limerick deal, money and mandate for the mayor, give the mayor more powers, and give the mayor more money, or the mayor's office, that we can use. So if that doesn't come through in the bill, the government will have a problem, because they'll say, we're being shortchanged here. We expected more, and all you're doing is splitting the jobs up, and off we go. So they do need to kind of think deeply on getting the bill through and how they get it through. But it's exciting on one side and probably scary on the other.
I reckon for you, it's probably a bit scary if nobody else, Pat, but we might come back to that. I'm sure people have got lots of questions. I just want to ask one before we move on to the next panelist. What sort of checks and balances do you think are going to be in place to make sure you get someone in that role, given it's going to be like a chief executive role, but elected, that has the right qualifications, or shall we say skills, for the role?
Great question, Chris. And really, we don't have a role in that, because it's set up, it'll be like a presidential election. It'll be a shootout between candidates. It really is built on the same model as if anyone going for Parliament. They just have to come with what they call 100 nominators. So if they're independent, they get 100 citizens of the area to sign the declaration, or they're coming from the political party. So you could have Johnny the Clown, or you could have the university president, and after that, democracy rules.
Indeed. Well, let's hope it's not Johnny the Clown. Pat, take a breath there, and we'll come back to you with some more questions. I want to move on to, and by the way, there's been some discussion already in the chat, people doing the conversions of those numbers you're talking about, and it looks like that 1.4 billion translates to about 2 billion Australian dollars, for those who are wondering. I want to bring Steve in now. Steve Ruru is the CEO of Taranaki Regional Council in New Zealand. You may have heard a bit about Three Waters reform. I've been following this a little bit in media reports. It seems to be a moving feast with news every week. Steve's got a short presentation for us and is going to talk us through the overall nature of these reforms, why they're significant for local government, despite the name Three Waters, and how the sector's reacting to the change. Steve, over to you.
Great, thanks, Chris. Look, I think part of the story behind not only Three Waters but broader local government reform in New Zealand at the moment is the fact that it's been over 30 years since essentially the current model of local government in New Zealand was put in place in 1989. And other than the creation of Auckland Council in 2010, and Auckland, has about 1.7 million or 30-odd% of New Zealand's population represented in one council, and then you have another 77 local authorities representing the other 70-odd% of New Zealand's population. So there's a big imbalance there. But basically, other than the creation of Auckland, 12, 14 years ago, there's been no major change in local government in New Zealand for over 30 years. And it's fair to say there are a number of questions being asked about, is the model of local government still fit for purpose? And there have been a number of indicators of issues bubbling away beneath the surface, including accumulating quite significant infrastructure deficits. In the case of Three Waters, which is the water, wastewater, stormwater delivery, it's been estimated by work done with Scottish Water that deficit's up to about $180 billion that needs to be spent in the next 30 years. So a very significant investment required, and that's really driven a lot of reform, both the size of deficit, and also about 5 years ago, there was a very unfortunate incident in which Campylobacter got into a water supply in a place called Havelock North in New Zealand. We ended up with 6 deaths, 50 odd people in hospital, and about 4,500 people out of a population of 15,000 who felt unwell and sick as a result of the contamination of the local council-run water supply. So that event was really the trigger to say, hey, we cannot carry on as we are, and has led to the significant proposal of reform in Three Waters. And that reform of Three Waters, and I'll talk a bit more about the other major reforms in a minute, and fronting up to those, it's really indicative of reflecting the significant issues which are very much, in my view, largely international, climate change, environmental degradation, and the argument about the baby boomers being largely a consumer generation, growing disparities between the haves and have-nots, if you like, in New Zealand populations are also very much part of the debate and the broader environmental context within which reforms in New Zealand are being debated. So there are really, I would suggest, sort of 3 major levels of reforms. At the top level, there are 3 major pieces of reform happening right at the moment. And importantly, these major reforms, certainly the Tier 1 reforms, are being handled as distinct packages of change. Firstly, there is Three Waters, as I said, which is the water, wastewater, stormwater delivery. And look, in some of our rural and provincial councils, Three Waters can be sort of 30 to 40% of their turnover. So it's quite a significant. Basically, we're going to change that from being delivered by 70 odd councils into 4 major water service delivery entities across the whole of New Zealand. So quite significant reform proposed in there, and it's been quite controversial, which I'll comment on. In parallel with that, we are also looking at what's called our Resource Management Act, or effectively our environmental legislation, governing development, land use, and quality of the receiving environment, water management, for example, through Resource Management Act, is also going through major legislative review process at the moment. Again, legislation was put in place in 1992 and is now somewhat dated and needs to be updated to reflect the needs of today. What the government, in response to some of the noise, has also relatively recently set up is what's called a Future for Local Government review, which has been run as a ministerial inquiry, just looking at standing right back saying, what are the functions that local government should be delivering in the future, and going through a whole process around that. And we'll comment more on that, particularly looking at what's the role, how do our functions relate into central government functions. And so doing that function work before they start to look at the question of organisational form. At Tier 2 reforms, again, this is all occurring in which there's a whole raft of changes happening in a number of areas. Obviously, climate change, mitigation, adaptation, all the issues that I'm sure you're all grappling with are being dealt with through climate change legislation in New Zealand at the moment. We've got a major review of our emergency management legislation going on in parallel. And indeed, if you've been following the New Zealand news, we're just right in the middle of some major floods in the east coast of the North Island at the moment. And then a whole lot of issues around environmental quality, freshwater degradation, biodiversity, etc. That's also reform happening across there. And then there are a number of critical, what I've called sector enablers. Funding and financing, we've had 2 major reviews of the local government funding regime in New Zealand in the last 15 years, one done by the Productivity Commission, one done by an independent government inquiry, and they've gone nowhere. They are doorstops, sitting there waiting for somebody to pick them up and address the issues. There are a whole bunch of issues about how do you get consistency of sector performance, a bunch of issues of relatively poor performance in some parts of the country, obviously offset by other good performance in other areas. And so how do you get consistency across the whole of New Zealand, across a whole bunch of councils? And then the other critical issue as a nation we're continuing to grapple with, our Indigenous people, Māori, entered into the treaty, what's called the Treaty of Waitangi. So very topical at the moment is very strong moves into co-governance regimes in which you have 50-50 decision-making between local tangata whenua or Indigenous people and mainstream democratically elected councils. For example, that's a live debate. obviously leading to quite significant challenges about where that fits within the normal debate around one person, one vote. But arguably quite significant ground being traversed in New Zealand with the changing role of Māori in public sector decision making. This is a reasonably complex slide, but all I'm trying to illustrate with this is you've got the three major tier one reforms I talked to at the top, all going through. The blue line is talking about the consultation and engagement, through the policy development phase happening in yellow, and then implementation in green. What you see there over 2021, 22, heading towards sort of 2024 implementation is a number of major streams of reform, all happening in parallel, all happening, as we know, in an incredibly unsettled and turbulent environment with things like COVID-19 having a major impact on communities and putting real pressures on communities and the work we need to do. So what you've got is you've got a reform program in which central government has a clear mandate for reform. For the first time in 20 odd years, we have we don't have a coalition central government at the moment. We have the Labor Party was elected at the last election with enough of a majority to govern alone, which, as I said, is the first time in the last 20 years that we haven't had a coalition government. So they have a pretty rare political mandate to get on and make a whole lot of things happen. Many people would argue that they got there because of the strength of their management of COVID-19. But be that as it's may, they are taking the opportunity to drive major reform across the New Zealand public sector. It's been, because we're on 3-year elections terms, it's been done at considerable pace and speed. And there are separate pieces of reform they see which they aren't necessarily trying to integrate. They would argue that the Future for Local Government panel process should bring that reform all together. But what that process will do, of course, is pick up the pieces from things like Three Waters reform, RMA reform, and say, how do we build this together? So quite an ambitious change program, which of course is creating considerable uncertainty for the local government sector around New Zealand. And that, of course, is leading to different reactions from different local authorities and different communities in New Zealand. There are obviously some who see that reform and change as well overdue and just needs to happen, and let's get on with it. There are others who agree with the need to reform but object to the speed. And of course, there are a bunch of others who simply don't accept the need for change, are the laggards, if you like, in terms of normal change methodology and talk. And so they are putting up quite a fight. And you'll see the photo there is a group called Communities for Local Democracy, which is a collection of about 30 odd councils who have come together to fight the government on their reform agenda. And who are doing a number of interesting things, like, for example, they have lodged legal proceedings, what we call judicial review proceedings, to challenge the government's decision-making processes. So there is a whole bunch of different reactions to the reform process that's going on in New Zealand. I'm quite open and upfront about the fact I'm of the view that local government reform, I'm in the pro-reform category in New Zealand, if you like. And I, like a number of others, very much looking at, so what are the opportunities that change creates and for local government in New Zealand? And in that sense, very much talking about, the power of localism and the importance of being able to deliver services at place in a joined up way. And that, that local government, if it's connected with its communities well, has a pretty strong and important role to play as a convener of services and a convener of agencies to deliver the services that are needed at place. Very strong opportunity to create a whole of government or a system approach. At the moment, one of the arguments is that there is a lack of trust in it, and look, I buy into, accept this as an issue between central government agencies and local government. And so some opportunities in here as to how do we actually create a better integration of the work we do between central and local government agencies and deliver better joined up services at that place level. There is a need, as we, the changing world in which we all live, to deliver services and be quite sophisticated and smart about the way in which we deliver services at real pace and in terms of the change and continuing to evolve them. And we are seeing, I think there is a very strong argument for greater scale being needed, particularly in some of our major infrastructure services, such as Three Waters, such as roading and public transport, where if we're being honest, there are also very significant infrastructure deficits in New Zealand at the moment. Opportunity for partnering with Maori and recognising the role of the treaty, and indeed the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People is also a very topical issue in New Zealand at the moment. And how do we ensure that we give them greater say within the models in which we work? And sitting beneath, of course, linked into that issue is the whole issue of what I call equity of outcomes and ensuring there is consistency of your targeting service delivery to the areas of greatest need to create that opportunity of greater equity of outcomes and addressing some of the social gaps that inevitably exist in New Zealand. So there are lots of opportunities. We do have the range of reactions to change and the speed of change that you would expect everywhere. And Three Waters is really the first cab off the blocks in terms of leading that change process. So lots of interesting opportunities and lessons to observe from afar as New Zealand goes through its change process in the next 3 to 4 years.
Fabulous, Steve. Thank you. I understand so much more about that now. We will come to questions after we hear from our other speakers. Steve, it strikes me those newspaper articles you showed us on that first slide describing local government as a mess and etc. As a current CEO in the sector, how do you feel about that image being presented? Is it fair?
Look, I think it is fair. Like probably local government everywhere, we've always had the odd pocket where things haven't necessarily gone well for a whole bunch of reasons. I've been around the sector now for about 25 odd years, and the number of problems are the most extensive I've seen them in that time. And there's a whole bunch of factors driving that. We have, I think it is fair, and I think the questions of as I said, I'm a bit of a pro-reform addict, and believe there is a need. There are better opportunities and models out there, and we need to be exploring those, but doing so with start from the point of what other functions we should be performing. How do we create better joined up service delivery across the broader public sector, and then work out the form follows function piece. And in doing that, absolutely, again, I'm a firm advocate of this, the role of what I call the representative leader, the politically elected leaders, is incredibly important and needs to be respected. But recognise that, particularly in big infrastructure, these are actually, a lot of a typical New Zealand council will manage over $1 to $2 billion of public assets. These are significant assets, and if you're building up significant deficits and continuing to kick the can down the road in terms of that infrastructure provision, that's a problem that needs to be addressed.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks for that very frank answer, Steve. Just one really quick one. You talked about the 30 councils that are challenging the process. That's out of how many councils in New Zealand?
There's 78 councils in New Zealand.
Okay. Well, so, it's not that much short of half, is it? All right. Thanks, Steve. A reminder to pop your questions in the chat. We've got some coming for Steve and Pat already, and we'll get to those after we hear from Rachel and Marcus. So Rachel, sitting there just north of London, lovely to have you with us. Rachel Shimmin is the CEO of Buckinghamshire Council. 2 years ago, Buckinghamshire was formed from 5 authorities merging into one unitary council. And Rachel led that transition as the CEO of the original county council. Just imagine that, folks, leading that process, not knowing what's going to happen at the end of it. Thankfully for Rachel, she's the inaugural CEO of the new merged authority. Rachel, welcome.
Hi there.
Tell us, firstly, what was the prompt for this particular reform to bring these 5 authorities together?
One of the things that's been really interesting listening to colleagues from New Zealand and Ireland is how common the issues are. So I think globally, we've got issues, haven't we, around how do we make best use of resource? How do we make our voices heard for the local place into the national mechanisms, whatever they are, and how do we make best use of limited resource? And of course, those were the issues facing us. So what we had was a county council, so responsible for about 550,000 people. We spend as local government in Buckinghamshire now £1.3 billion, so about 2.3 billion Australian dollars, 2.4 billion New Zealand dollars. And yet we felt that we weren't getting enough efficiency out of that. And of course, what happens when you've got a two-tier system, which is what we had, so the county council for some things, district councils for others, and then in fact, in our case, town and parish councils as well. So in fact, 3 tiers, is that it gets very complicated. And we worked out that we used to spend something like £36,000 a year telling people that they'd rung the wrong council for services. Now, I always think that's a really interesting example of the fact that everybody was confused. And yet, when we moved to become a unitary, we had significant opposition in the way Steve's described, actually, from our district councils who also launched a judicial review in relation to process. So our drivers were simplicity, improved services, better use of resource, and a stronger single voice for the place into central government.
So set the scene for us, if you would, Rachel, where you are, what's the combined population, what sorts of challenges does your combined communities face?
So we're a funny old place, Buckinghamshire, because we're one of the home counties. So those counties surrounding London who are thought to be actually quite affluent. I moved down to Buckinghamshire from the least affluent place in England, the northeast. So you can imagine the house price differential that we met as a family. There we are. But what happens in a place like Buckinghamshire, and some of the other home counties are very similar, is that you've got very significant pockets of deprivation. And I think others have spoken about the gap, the widening of the gap in terms of inequalities. But we've got a population that overall, compared to some of the national averages, are wealthier. But we've got very significant challenges in things like house prices. So I won't convert it to dollars, but you'll get the sense when I tell you that our average income for residents in this county is £28,000 a year. The average house price in this county is £450,000 a year. That's the average. So we've got some really big challenges around affordability. We've got overemployment. So we've got lots of vacancies in the sector. Got a 2-tier system in schools. So we've got some selective grammar schools and we've got some non-selective schools. And we've got some enormous national infrastructure projects. So something called High Speed 2 Rail, much maligned by residents of this county because it's very disruptive and we don't think it brings us any benefit. Something called East West Rail, which cuts across the county. We've got some issues around London development, and we've got some big housing targets. So we've got an interesting mix of issues which are not immediately obvious to people looking into Buckinghamshire.
Mm-hmm. I'm struck by similarities to many of the councils that are on our call tonight that would be feeling as well. So talk to us about this process that was used to bring the councils together and your role as CEO of one of those councils charged with leading that process.
So the first thing to say on a human level is it's really stressful. It's really stressful because what you're working on doing is something that you believe is right. And like Steve, I'm a big reformer in this space because I think it's the right thing to do for communities, businesses, and the public pound, actually. So we decided that we would ask government to consider moving us into a single entity. There was no proper process in place nationally. And so you felt like you were playing a game that you didn't understand the rules for. So that was really quite difficult. There was no framework around this is the sort of evidence that you need to provide. So we were constantly trying to serve up information we thought would be useful. Our district councils absolutely disagreed with the proposition. They felt the county council was inefficient, too slow, didn't understand how to do change. And they eventually put in a proposition to government that suggested the county was split into 2, a north and a south. So we had 2 years worth of conversations with government, during which time relationships with our district colleagues were at an all-time low. because there were very, very different views about the right way to do things. Our district colleagues in the public domain were very openly critical of the county council, which I fundamentally believed was wrong and unhelpful to anybody, actually. But that was the behaviour that played out. The behaviours, I think, shouldn't be underestimated when you look at reform of this nature. We had several different Secretary of States in government during our time, and eventually it was agreed that we would move to a single unitary. A judicial review followed, was not agreed, and then we started this move to a single unitary. So bringing together all 5 councils into a brand new entity in record time, actually. So we did it in about 14 months. Oh. Lots of project plan. My own view was, we're not going to get some management consultancy to do this. I want our people in all the councils who understand the business and understand the place to be the people that lead the design and the implementation. And that's what we did. So we brought people together very quickly in an environment still of hostility. What helped with that, of course, was the appointment for the new CEO, which I applied for and was appointed to. That was an external appointment, and rightly so, in my view. The game changer, really, in terms of the culture of the organisation, actually was COVID, because as we went live, we were locked down, and everybody had to start working differently. And it felt like, you know, a bit of a first world problem, actually. The merger of organisations, what is it we needed to really focus on? And people just got their head into a different space, but it was certainly a challenging time.
So just so I'm clear, you're leading this transition process at the same time as you're actually applying to effectively keep your job at the end of it.
Yes.
Yeah, that I can imagine that had some stress attached to it as well.
Lots of toffee, Chris. Lots of toffee at my end. Was very helpful.
Fair enough. What would you do differently now? I don't know whether it's related to perhaps the reality check from the pandemic or just lessons learned. If you're starting this again, would you start in a different place or do anything differently?
So in terms of what I would do differently, I would be more bullish, actually, about the fact it was going to happen. And I tried very hard for a long time to be very collegiate, because I think that's the right set of behaviours. But actually, ultimately, what I had to say was, do you know what? I'm sorry you don't like it, but it's happening. My name's in the order. So the government in England make a structural changes order. I was named as the person legally responsible for delivering the change. And we're going to do it, and here's how we're going to do it, and if you've got any comments, I'm really happy to receive them, but we need to get on. I'd have done that about 4 months earlier, because it was just so torturous, actually, the disagreements, people feeling as if they were being demoted. It was really difficult, but I would be more bullish. But I think, you know, you try and bend over backwards to take people with you in public services, because you know it's psychologically the right thing to do. There is definitely a psychological impact for you as the leader in trying to do that, because people are behaving badly. People are not applying the same values you're trying to apply to them in the way you treat them. So I made sure I had quite a lot of support around me, because it got really tough. But I would be much more bullish.
Yeah. Catherine, I think you've got a question.
Look, I do. Rachel, could you just talk us through where were the greatest pockets of opposition and I guess support? Was it at the, what we would call here in Australia, the officer level, so at the sort of CEO staff down, or, you know, were the elected representatives on board? Who was really driving the change?
So the opposition to the change was from both. So the people driving the change were the county council and most of its members, but some of the members of the then county council were also members of the district councils. So you effectively had a split between the members in the county council, some of whom were leaders of the very district councils who were putting in a JR against the county councils, a successful request to become a unitary. So resistance was in two forms: senior and junior officer level in districts for sure, and that was attention for everybody, and definitely from elected members.
Great question, Catherine. All right, Rachel, we'll let you take a breath. And again, I say to the audience, please pop your questions in the chat, because we're getting very close to open forum time. I want to bring in Marcus Spiller from SGS Economics and Planning, Principal and Partner there. Marcus, good evening to you. I imagine this has been of great interest to you in the area that you spend all your time thinking about potential reforms. You're going to talk to us about that overall governance role of local government and what might happen in the future in the reform space.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. And while my presentation's coming up there, I'll make the admission that I do feel like a bit of an imposter amongst this very illustrious panel. I don't work in local government. I work with and for local government, but they are very much part of my professional life, and I've spent a lot of time thinking about how local government can improve, but also how it can carve out its proper role within the overall system of governance across Australia. And because of our international audience, I'll mention that unlike New Zealand and unlike the UK, Australia has a multiplicity of governments owing to its status as a federation. So the Commonwealth, we have the Commonwealth government, which collects roughly 80% of the taxes. We have state governments and local governments. And it's interesting to me that notwithstanding all the struggles that local governments have, and we heard them particularly clearly, I think, from Steve over in Taranaki there, their financial constraints, their limited resources, and the escalating demands, the surveys that we see, the regular surveys that we see regarding level of trust in government, shows local government always outperforming the other spheres. Now, I think all governments enjoyed an uptick during the COVID crisis here in Australia, but councils have recorded relatively strongly on that parameter for decades. But notwithstanding their performance and notwithstanding how protective communities are of their local governments, the proposition that I have for discussion tonight is that they're not allowed to live up to their potential because of the constraints put on them by the state governments. They are the creatures of the state government. They're not the creatures of the Commonwealth government. The Commonwealth has no jurisdiction over local government. Local governments live or die based on the desires of the state government. But I will put to you that state governments have really woven a web around local government, and we haven't seen the value that they can provide. So if we can move to the next slide. The way I the conceptual framework that I apply to think about successful governance, not just at local government level, but at all spheres of government, is this threefold one, that a sphere of governance will only maximize the value that it can offer its community, and in this case we're talking about local government, if these three conditions are met. There is a need to have a democratic mandate, at least in Western liberal countries. We expect to vote for our lawmakers, our tax raisers, and our tax spenders. And that is if you like, it's a given. And we heard already tonight and this morning from Pat how in some jurisdictions a lot of effort goes into reinforcing that democratic mandate. The second one is that the sphere of governance, that local government, should have a clearly defined set of functions with reference to the subsidiarity principle. And that is a set of services and functions within which it should have, I won't say unfettered discretion, but a high degree of discretion in terms of quality, quantity, and coverage in terms of delivery. The local government should be able to treat with its community about the array of services, about the extent of those services, about the cost of those services, so that ultimately, if you like, people can find a community, can find a local government that suits them best. But I'm not, in saying that, promoting a kind of an American model of local governance. My idea here is that whilst you have local discretion, maximum local discretion over local matters, there needs to be strong state and Commonwealth action in terms of redistribution and equalisation of fiscal capacity, so that we do not have different regions drifting further apart on the equality spectrum. The final parameter is around fiscal autonomy. So that's the other side of the coin, if you like, in terms of the functions which are within the bailiwick of local government. Local government should have the capacity to strike a deal with the community or offer a deal to the community in terms of quality, quantity versus taxation. When we look at the actual situation, certainly here in Victoria and in my experience right across the Australian continent, very few of these conditions are met. Councils are rate capped. They have no discretion over, well, they have a very limited amount of discretion over property taxes. They have, unlike some other jurisdictions, no capacity for local income or consumption taxes. Their functions are strictly confined and supervised by the state government. There's regular cost shifting by state government to local government. There's very fuzzy subsidiarity with a constant threat of intervention by the state government. So in short, local government in our country isn't treated with a great deal of respect, I'm afraid. Rather, it's treated as, if you like, the municipal service arm of the state government to do the direct bidding of local government, of state government. Now, there is a democratic mandate, and we do faithfully go and elect our councillors. I think very few citizens can even remember who they voted for. So that part of this three-legged stool is there in place. But because the overall sector isn't really treated with respect, in my humble opinion, I think this feeds back into the people in the community who are motivated to put their hand up to run for election, and that also has feedback effects in terms of the way local government runs. So my overall message is that local government is a treasure. It is a democratic treasure. It can enrich the lives of people. It can be a source of innovation, which, well, it has been a source of innovation and can be an even greater source of innovation in terms of public service delivery, but it's being held back by overly restrictive state government regulation and restrictions.
Thank you, Marcus. I'm seeing lots of nodding and some interesting reactions to some of those ideas you're putting forward. Realistically, to address those issues you raise, what needs to change? Like, how realistically can we deal with those issues, do you think?
Well, look, I think, I love the way they do things in New Zealand. Smaller country, I suppose, tend to take a more holistic perspective. When we think of local government reform in Australia, we think of how can we make them more efficient? How can we cut costs? Now, I did some numbers, actually, it just comes to mind. For those who are not here in Victoria, Melbourne, up until the COVID crisis, was one of the world's fastest growing cities in the, if you like, the developed world. So the need for all manner of urban services, the demand for it was escalating very, very rapidly. And when you looked at the employment numbers for the state government, you saw that they ramped up rapidly in line with the increase in population. When you looked at the local government numbers, they stayed flat. I mean, there's strong evidence that local government is more efficient, is more nimble, gets more value out of the taxpayer's dollar than their colleagues in state and Commonwealth government. But nevertheless, every time we think of local government, we think of it as a problem. How can we whack more of them together? Let's save some costs on CEOs and senior management. Let's get some economies of scale. We don't think of it in terms of what value they provide to the community in terms of democratic engagement, in terms of community building and so forth. So of course, I'm interested in efficiency and cost saving, but I don't start with that. That's the tail, that's not the dog. We should perhaps have a more far-reaching review of why we have local government. If at the end of the day we feel that we just need some localised municipal service deliverers that are contracted by the state government, so be it. But if we want a democratic dimension to it, then it has to be genuinely democratic and unlock the potential benefit that brings. So get up higher rather than down in the weeds is the way that I would go about the reform process.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Catherine?
Thanks, Chris. And Marcus, you must have read the VLGA's submission to the review that's happening at the moment into the culture of local government in Victoria. But I know I must acknowledge that Marcus was one of the stakeholders that we did consult with to inform our submission. But look, we've exactly highlighted those points in this submission, and that is, if the government is undertaking a review into the culture, that I guess they're assuming that there is a problem with the culture in local government. Again, I'm only talking very local here, Victoria. But, what are the parameters of that review? And we talked a lot about the need for the sector to have that level of respect, Marcus, that you referred to, because that also flows down then to the community's perceptions, the media's perception. I mean, just the other day, I was unfortunately asked again to quote in the media about whether councils should just be limited to roads, rates and rubbish. And I would think surely we've moved beyond that. When we look at the purpose of councils in the Victorian Local Government Act, it basically says to ensure the community health and well-being, or the health and well-being of the municipality, and outlines some significant governance responsibilities for these very complex businesses that are councils. And that's not particularly well understood. And a lot of what Steve said over there in New Zealand really resonated for me here in recently. We did a review as part of the Project Control Board overseeing the implementation of the Local Government Act in Victoria. And there are significant policies across various departments in, I guess, which would be the equivalent of the central government, although it's the state government here in Victoria, that impact the local government sector. And in Victoria, we have a Victorian State Local Government Agreement where the state is supposed to consult with the sector extensively before they implement any policies or legislation that might impact upon the sector. And unfortunately, as Marcus has implied, that's not really a living and breathing document.
Thanks, Catherine. We're coming to open forum, and I know we've got some hands up and some questions in the chat, which I'll come to you for in a second, Catherine. I just want to go back to one of Marcus's points about this contention that local government isn't respected as it should be. And I'm wondering whether that's resonating with our international panelists. Is that a conversation that happens in England, in Ireland, in New Zealand? Perhaps you first, Rachel, about respect for the local level?
So I suppose the question in my mind is, as our colleague said, that was from whom. So I guess my observation, and I feel as if I can speak with some authority on this, having lived through the last X years, I think there's a fundamental misunderstanding at central government level about what local government actually do. So my view is that local government, particularly local government when it's unitarised, so it's got much broader responsibilities, is a place shaper, a commissioner of services, a deliverer of services, a bellwether for how people feel, a policy maker, a strategic advisor, a co-producer. Do I think all of those roles are properly understood by central government? I absolutely do not. And I think if they were properly understood, we would get further faster nationally and internationally. And what I would really like to see are some secondments across local and national government, even for 3 months, so that we've all got a better understanding. So, you know, do I understand the real pressure civil servants will come under from ministers? Probably not, because I've never been a civil servant, and I suspect I'd be sacked pretty quickly if I was, because I'm not a yes minister kind of woman. But I do think that there would be real benefit in doing the crossover, because I think we would have a better understanding. And I also think ministers nationally would benefit from spending time with council leaders so that they really understand the issues that we're facing. So that would be my observation. Great, thanks, Rachel. Pat, what's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I kind of take a bit different from Rachel. Yeah, I think the Irish system has matured very much in the last number of years. Yeah, I think there's a big a re-recognition, if I can call it that, of, because most of the government ministers have come through council, they have come through the local system, they've understood it. And what I found particularly, and I think Rachel made a good point around COVID, COVID was quite interesting for government. I think they understood the value of a local authority as a distribution system. We ended up getting into payments for companies, startup supports, closed down regimes, everything. And I think the government really, I think, hammered home to them the value of the local authority in being close to the people and having systems to keep close to the people. And I have to say, the ministers, I've never seen as many ministers come meet, as Rachel has been suggesting, with both council leaders and political leaders. Like last week, we had our transport minister, who probably has a very different view because he's a green minister, about how roads should develop and where roads should be or not be. But he came, asked to meet the council, came to the council and had a rip-roaring debate with them. And I think it was very productive, even though we probably run opposite sides on some of the stuff. Previously, the housing minister has been down, our parent department is local government, obviously, but has been down working the patch, sleeves up, saying, how are we going to fix this housing issue and what would you do about it? And taking that back and putting best practice and bringing us all together. And that's happening across all divisions. So I think the Irish government is kind of walking up to the fact, wow, we have to bring government locally, and the way to do that is through the local authority. So it's a bit of a different scene in Limerick, in Ireland, sorry. One thing I'm picking up onto that issue of housing, it's truly global at the moment. We could do a whole session on that again, I'm sure. Steve, just quickly to you, remembering those headlines you showed us that talk about local government needing reform, is that a sign of a lack of respect for it as a level of government in New Zealand, do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. And indeed, I was just, the Future for Local Government review that I mentioned as one of the big reform processes. In one of their recent reports, they talk about a culture of mistrust between central and local government. And look, to me, that sums up in 4 or 5 words what effectively Rachel was talking about, which is very prevalent in New Zealand. And that culture of mistrust gets reflected in a lot of ways where central government ends up becoming much more directive and through legislation and some of the other national policy statements we have to have regard to in New Zealand. And I would even argue at times they end up duplicating, putting in backstops when they don't trust the sector to actually deliver. So it is a real issue for us here in NZ and certainly a key driver in some of our reform processes at the moment.
Thanks, Steve. Well, I reckon we've got the price of admission just from all of those insights already tonight, and we've got some open forum time now, and we tend to let this go as long as we can, but we do have a bit of a cut-off time by 8 o'clock or thereabouts. So, Catherine, how are we looking with questions and comments coming through?
We've got a few in the chat, but before we get to those, I do know that Richard Reardon has had his hand up, so we'll just go over to Richard and let him address us. Thanks, Richard.
I won't bore you with an address tonight. You've had 4 great speakers, Catherine. Thank you. But the one question I have, certainly in my preparation and only new to the job, but getting around the sort of desire for local government to be fully integrated and respected as a genuine level of government is a very strong theme. But Also to the way we govern, and I guess Victoria's been through the reform process and amalgamations 20 odd years ago, but the one element of reform I haven't heard about, and I would be interested to hear from the panellists, is about the rating/taxation reform. At the end of the day, rates are a tax. And looking at my little ready reckoner that I keep in very close to me, our wealthiest communities on a $1.2 million property pay approximately $1,100 in tax. Our poorest community, if they actually had a house worth 1.2 million, they'd be paying 9,000. It's the only level of government where taxation, equity, transparency, value for money is completely hidden and not at all fair. I guess I pose that in an era where we're no longer little regional road boards like we were in 1850, essentially just providing culverts and drains to the local community that lived there. We're now all interconnected. People have great mobility. People expect their local public toilets to work and flush and be clean and looked after. They expect their roads to be safe. The current model, certainly in the Victorian circumstance, to me, is not viable going forward and needs a really good look at. And so to the panellists, I ask, in the governance reforms that you've undertaken, have you managed to come up with a local government taxing system that's a little bit more modern than the 700-year-old one that we operate under now?
What a great question. And I'm often reminded that local council rates are, for most people, the only tax you actually get a bill for. The rest of it is very not as transparent. So I wonder who'd like to tackle that first from our panelists. No one's jumping.
I'll have a slight variation on that, Chris. My comment would be, and look, this, as I said, we've had two major funding reviews in New Zealand in the last 15 years, with the last one being just published probably about 2.5 years ago. One of the key points made in that about rating and taxing in local government is we actually need to make greater use of the full range of tools and flexibility we have. And I think that is a valid enough point. Often, certainly in the New Zealand context at times, and we have had a lot of debate about unfunded mandates or expectations being passed down from central government to local government without necessarily the funding following, which is a valid issue, absolutely. But also I think at a local government level, we do need to make sure we get innovative and flexible around using fully the full range of tools we have, because there is a lot of scope for greater use of some of those existing tools we have here in New Zealand. So that's certainly a live debate while respecting the bigger funding issue.
Thanks, Steve. I think Rachel and Marcus would like to make a comment. So Rachel, I'll come to you first.
Yeah, so it's a funny old system for us in England, because we've got, as people might be aware, we've got general taxation on income, we've got national insurance tax, which is about to go up in this country. We've also got income from business rates, we've got income from charging for some services, and then we've got council tax, which is the local tax. So within the local tax system, the government effectively have passported responsibility for local councils, for instance, to try and raise additional tax linked to adult social care because of the demographic. And that is very uncomfortable for local members, because their sense is people on the doorstep are particularly concerned about roads, pavements, refuse. The bulk of funding now for councils in England, probably 60% plus for unitary councils, actually is spent on children's services and adult services. So it's a really difficult tension politically. Managerially, I'm very clear that we haven't got enough money in the system for all the things that people would like us to do. And we need some honest conversations with our politicians and our communities about how they want the tax take to be spent, what the priorities are, given we've got, you know, over 150 statutory responsibilities that have to be delivered, what's left for the other stuff. So I think it's a really complex picture.
Thanks, Rachel. Marcus and then Pat.
Yeah, look, I don't have an in principle problem with using property taxes to pay for property, essentially property related services, the roads, rates and rubbish stuff. But of course, local government does a lot more than that and deserves a broader palette of revenue raising opportunities. And you know, amongst those are things to do with, you know, how we charge for development rights, for example, which at the moment we by and large give away in our country. And I might add, are not ours anyway. They belong to the First Nations in the various parts of the country that that occupied that land before we did. But having said all of that, I think rate capping is the ultimate sign of distrust.
Yeah.
It's saying to local government, well, we can't trust you or your electors to work out what's best for your community. And for that reason alone, I think rate capping is a dodgy policy and is well past its use-by date.
Thanks, Marcus. I don't think anyone's jumping up to fight you on that point. Pat.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. No, I think very common to what colleagues have said on the call. Ireland has, we've just introduced a local property tax a number of years ago, which is a central system. We were allowed to vote on the percentage, what that should apply locally, because it's collected centrally and then it's reallocated. We normally go for the full, we can allow to go to 15%, and we've normally got that with council. But in our budget then annually, we present back to council where that's going to be spent. And it goes into roads or estate management or whatever. A big fight by people, nobody likes to pay tax, but once it came in, they've accepted, and it's based on the market value of the house and effectively like what we've just all described. The actual government had gone further, and they had fought a big battle publicly on water charges. And in fact had won the case because you had a real rural-urban divide, saying, well, you know, in the rural area, we're on water schemes, private schemes, we're paying for water since dot, and the cities had the luxury of central systems. And so they actually kind of fought themselves to a standstill publicly, and the government, I thought, had won it, but it dropped it. And they were at the last ditch, effectively, and I think people were willing to pay for water and pay for water usage. And they probably missed an opportunity there, but it may come back. It was very controversial, but they had won through in the end. What the property tax has already had a review, and it's gone up a little, and people have accepted it. And we're able to demonstrate then with the money we get, how we use it. And what we do generally is take that money, give it to the local district councils and say, this is how it can be spent. And they can then prove to their citizens where the money's going, and then it's easier to get that kind of percentage increase each year once it's gone very local. So it's well worth being transparent on it. Yeah.
Thanks very much, Pat. I hope that's helped you come up with a solution to the problem, Richard, and we look forward to hearing your ideas perhaps in due course. I'm being mischievous, of course. Now, Catherine, some questions, comments from the floor.
Yeah, look, thank you, Chris. I'll go back to the chat. There were a few in there, and thank you everyone for your patience there. Luke, you had a question about the current three water system, and that was around, is there a duty to cooperate between neighbouring authorities when it comes to infrastructure and wider management? So I'm assuming that question is, in the current system, is there that duty to cooperate?
And look, the short answer is no. It's encouraged, but there's no duty as such for them to cooperate and work together. And look, I think the other comment I would make about Three Waters in terms of how New Zealand's got itself to the place it has in Three Waters is, I think it's best, and this got very much reflected in the report done on Havelock North, which was the water supply I referenced, where we had the major problems about 4 years ago, is it identified a number of system failures. It wasn't just while there are big issues at the local government delivery level, there were system failures with the regulators, both environmental regulator and drinking water quality regulators. So it's actually a good example of the need to get that whole system design, think about the delivery of how you actually keep everybody honest in the system, and obviously cooperation and scale can be one of the solutions, and sharing of ideas one of the solutions to help improve lift system performance as a whole.
Thank you, Steve, for that. Sarah Race, I know you've got quite a long comment / question in the chat. I will let you talk to that if you don't mind.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Catherine. Sorry, it's a bit noisy at my house. My kids are running around before bed. Just wanted to, I think the local government sector has a great capacity for reform, and I think there's some great models. I'm quite interested in community wealth building, but there seems to be a natural conservatism, and I think a few of the presenters have spoken to that tonight. I was wondering how whoever thinks that we can maybe overcome that conservatism and bring our communities with us on the path to reform.
Good question. Who'd like to tackle that? Rachel, I see some nodding. I'm going to take that as you've got an answer.
So I think it's important to understand what communities are most concerned about. I think that's where we should start. So I think people here, just speaking from my experience here, and I've done this reform gig in another part of the country as well, and the issues are remarkably similar. So my view is people want to know that they're going to get a response. They want to know that their local council understands the issues for them in their place. They want a means of having a conversation at a very local level. And one of the things that we did, and this built on experiences in other parts of the country in England, councils who've gone before us in unitarisation, is we developed a series of community boards across particular localities. Now, they're not delivering services, because actually that reduces the economy of scale and the resilience you get from unitarising, although we do have some devolved services like grass cutting, you know, which make much more sense for a parish council to do. But our community boards bring together the town and parish councils, members of the public, other statutory and public bodies and ourselves to talk about the issues that matter. We give them a budget so that they can try and draw in other funding. We encourage them to identify and understand the issues that matter. And then we use our local members, and we've got 147 at the minute in Buckinghamshire. They're biggest in the country, soon to come down to 96. We use our local members also as kind of eyes and ears in the community. But I do think the starting point has to be, what is it that you're most concerned about? And I think the other thing for me is, don't underestimate that people get confused about what reform means. So when we went round the county talking to communities, we did open forum meetings in advance of the go live, thankfully before COVID, so we could do it face to face. People were really mixed up. I remember being in one part of the county, actually the part I live in, and somebody saying, I don't want to be forced to go to a different hospital. It's got nothing to do with the hospital, you know. So we know this stuff because we live and breathe it, but actually lots of people just don't understand it, and nor do they need to. But I think we've got to be really aware of misunderstanding, miscommunication, and help people through, you know, the use of frequently asked questions, open forums. But I would always start with, what is it you're concerned about?
Thanks, Rachel. And certainly within, you know, the Victorian state or the Local Government Act, there is now that legislated requirement for community consultation that has also, it's been expected in the past, but not legislated for in the same way that it is now. So I think there's opportunities through that also. Councillor Moira Berry from Moorabool, I know you had a couple of questions in the chat also.
Thank you, Catherine. My question was, sorry, I'm from Moorabool Council. It's in Victoria, the lower state, smaller state at the bottom of Australia. The shire I'm in is quite small, so our population, you know, up to 38,000, and it's a growth area. So my question to Rachel was, what's the difference between, I listened to you and you mentioned county council and district council, and that members can be a member of both. So I just wanted a little bit more understanding on the separation between the two.
Okay, so I'll try and explain it quickly. So in England, we've got different forms of council. A unitary council does everything, all of the services. So education, safeguarding, child protection, public health, roads, highways, pay, everything, consumer services, everything. A county council is an overarching administration across a county geography. And in some counties, like mine, you're a county unitary. So you're a bigger unit of local government and you do everything. If you're a two-tier county, the county does children's services, education, highways, some other services, but the district councils do things like refuse collection, planning, housing. So you can see that there's a real disconnect actually, because those functions are interdependent. But there is different functionality, and a good rule of thumb for county and district is that in those systems, counties have 80% of everything. They have 80% of the total 100% budget for local government. They employ 80% of the staff. And often one of the concerns districts have in England is that they don't feel as listened to by government and government departments as the counties. So there's a real tension often. And in delivery, it gets crowded and complicated, in my view, because there's a bit of a buy-in for who's doing what. Currently seeing that here on Ukraine, there's a big push from the districts to say, why are you giving all the data to the counties? Why aren't we getting it directly? Why are you giving the money to the counties? Why aren't we getting there is a real tension. The benefit from the county perspective is their view would be we're closer to communities, just in the interest of balance.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Rachel. Catherine, can we have one more question perhaps from the floor?
Look, we will. And I think Jane Ogden had a question that she'd put in, or a question in the chat. Jane, did you want to speak to that?
Oh, look, I think it's opening a can of worms, Catherine and Chris. So it's sort of a comment. It's just been in discussion today, and it was just pointing out the difference between, so especially with housing. And again, like you said, Chris Eddy, we could do a whole thing on it. But, that I was talking to some CEOs, and they were just saying that if local governments could take over the planning, and I don't even understand all of that, but just the planning to do with opening up new land for developers. Come on, Jane. And we could get some housing, a lot of our housing issues happening quicker, because it just takes so long to go through state government. Yes. That was my can of worms. Don't worry about answering it.
Thanks, Jane. We will take it as a comment, and I think we definitely need to do more on housing. That's a very clear thing coming out of today. So, Catherine, if I may, I've got one sort of final little question for the panelists. I'm always keen to understand, how do we measure success when we go down these paths of change? And maybe, Rachel, firstly, what will success look like for you from the reforms that you've implemented?
Well, I think there are a range of different indicators. So there's an indicator for me about our key performance indicators. Where is our performance? Have we improved the services we set out to improve? So I monitor our KPIs every week. I started with a KPI set before we went into lockdown, because actually I wanted to measure the impact of working from home on output and performance. So I monitor those every week. So that's one measure for me. Staff satisfaction as our employees is another important measure for me, because it's an obvious point, but we're only successful if our staff are successful. So staff engagement and the percentage of staff who are ambassadors is another measure for me that I look at. Have we made the financial efficiencies we said we would make is another measure for me. The views of partners and whether they're finding that easier to work with us is another measure, and community satisfaction is a measure for me. So we did a community survey before we moved into unitary, and what we said was, after N months, and we're going to move that back out a bit now because of COVID, we'll take another measure and we'll see how it lands. So I think there's a whole series of measures that we use to measure success. I do think there'll always be people who think back to the previous and think actually that was better. My view is, but it's gone now, so let's move forward. But I do think we're always going to get some people who are resistors for a period of time.
Thanks, Rachel. Pat, these massive governance reforms coming for you, if you had your crystal ball 5 years, 10 years from now, what will be better because of it?
Yeah, I think two things. We're going through, for the first time ever, a unitary development plan. So we're used to having a city one and a county one. That's getting a hot debate. It should be over the line come the summer, and that sets up the future. That's preparing the place for another 50,000 population growth, 30,000 jobs, and about another 20,000 homes, and everything we do to plan for that. I think success will be that delivered on time and at pace. And I think if they finally pull the trigger on the directly elected mayor, that is embedded in the system and highly efficient. So I think, and the measures we have then, I think, like Rachel, speed and efficiency, and that coming through on, we have a very strong customer relationship management system, so that we can measure quite a lot in that. We've built it robustly to look at speed and efficiency, and you can see a trend line in it, so that'll tell us a lot. And I think obviously staff survey morale, the numbers have been popping up stronger from the amalgamation, that it's settled now. And I think people are comfortable where they are. So there are two big measures. And if we look down the barrel, that's where I'd see success. And
Pat, you mentioned earlier potentially more government investment as a result of the change. Is that something you'd be tracking too as a measure? Yeah, I think I'm going to watch what the bill head is like when it gets finally voted through and what's left on the table. And particularly that we had an advisory committee for the minister. He put it together. It was a very good group made of stakeholders, public, private, politician. And really we came down to two things: money and mandate. So can the mayor get more of a mandate? And we're a bit different in Ireland. We don't do education and policing and stuff. We do everything else. Would they get a share of that? I think there's a huge resistance from obviously central government to give the mayors any more power. Fair enough. But if they get money and they get a kind of a levelling up deal, then they have money to buy mandate, and then they can start fixing things. So I'm watching that block grant. We've argued very heavy. Can we get more money as a mayoral, directly mayoral city region? And that'll be a fair measure. And if it's a big number, we're going to have success. But if it's a small number, then it may struggle a bit. But that's follow the money. Fingers crossed and good luck. Just looking for a couple of really quick answers because we're about out of time. So Steve, what's success look like for you?
Read my last slide. Hit it up the opportunity.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And we have been asked about the slides. If our presenters are happy to have those slides provided to participants, you can read that list of opportunities that Steve was talking about. Marcus, from an analytical perspective, are they the right sort of measures? Is that what you'd expect?
Look, they sound fine. I think we shouldn't lose sight of the fact, though, that people have a right to local government. A world that is overly centralised in terms of government is a diminished world. So even above and beyond the actual services delivered by local government, it is a public benefit to have local government, and it's incumbent upon us to strengthen it as a democratic institution. So that's my starting point. I'd be looking at the health of the democracy. And I'd be looking also at indicators about the extent to which state government views local government as a peer and a partner rather than as a servant.
All right. Thank you, Marcus. Catherine, any final comments before we wrap up?
No, look, I'm really conscious of the time, Chris, but I would, on behalf of the VLGA, like to thank our panellists, Marcus, Rachel, Steve and Pat. Pat, I am just intrigued about the reform or that potential bill that's about to go through, and I look forward to hearing how that all transpires. And I'd love to see the job description for the CEO / directly elected mayor versus what essentially would become your role as it currently is, from what I understand. And yes, look, and to all of our participants tonight, thank you for making the time. I know 6:30 is getting a little on the late side for some of us here, but it was very early over in the UK and even later for Steve in New Zealand. So these panels we find, as Hannah indicated at the beginning, we've got about 4 more, I think, this year, really rich sources of discussion and information for us to contemplate. Thank you.
Thanks, Catherine. That's been a fabulous discussion. So I'll just add my thanks to all 4 panellists. They've been terrific to deal with in all the different time zones as we prepared for this. I want to thank the folks at LGIU for their assistance as well. And of course, Catherine, Steve and the team at the VLGA. Just leaves me to thank all of you for joining us on this Thursday evening or morning, wherever you are. Thank you very much. Keep an eye out for more on our global panel series. This will be produced up on the YouTube channel from VLGA Connect for members to view in the next few days, and you'll get some advice about that along with the slides. So thank you all, and see you all again soon. Good night or good morning to you.